There is a kind of silence that only exists deep inside the Appalachian Mountains. Not the silence of an empty room or a city street late at night. This is something older. A silence layered with the sound of wind moving through hemlock and white oak, with the distant crack of ice forming on a creek that won't see sunlight for 3 months. It is the silence of a world that does not wait for you, does not care about your comfort, and will bury you in snow before spring arrives if you are not paying very close attention. For the families who made their lives in these mountains, running from southwestern Virginia up through West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and into the deep hollows of North Carolina, survival was never a concept. It was a daily practice. It was something you learned before you fully understood what learning meant. You watched your father split wood in a particular way. You watched your mother press dried herbs between her fingers and bring them to her nose, deciding without a word whether they were still good. You learned by being present inside a life that demanded presence. And most of what those people knew is gone now. Not lost in some dramatic catastrophe. Not burned or flooded away. Just quietly replaced, absorbed into the convenience of a world that found easier paths and forgot to look back. The grocery store made the smokehouse seem unnecessary. The pharmacy made the herb garden seem quaint. The furnace made the art of banking a fire through the night seem like a story from another time. But those skills existed for a reason. Each one was the result of generations of trial and absolute error, of families who watched someone do it wrong and paid an irreversible price for it. Every technique had a logic behind it, a logic built not in a laboratory, but in the actual conditions of mountain winters where the temperature could drop 40 degrees in 12 hours, where roads became impassable for weeks, where the nearest doctor might be a half-day's ride on horseback through terrain that wanted to kill you. This is about those 25 skills, not as a list, not as a museum exhibit, but as a living record of what it actually meant to survive in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North American history. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on Earth. Geologists estimate they began forming over 480 million years ago, which means they were already ancient when the dinosaurs arrived. By the time European settlers began pushing into the highlands in the 1700s, these mountains had been worn down by time into something that looked almost gentle from a distance. Rounded ridges, long hollows, dense forest canopy. But that gentleness was a lie. The terrain was brutal. The growing season was short. The winters arrived early and stayed long. Families who tried to farm the lower land were already crowded out, and so they climbed. Scots-Irish immigrants in particular moved deep into the hollows, where land was cheap because it was hard, and they built their lives with almost nothing except what they brought in their hands and what they could learn from the land itself. By the mid-1800s, entire communities existed in these mountains that had almost no contact with the outside world for months at a time. A family in the deep hollows of eastern Kentucky might go from October until April without seeing anyone from outside their own valley. Their survival depended entirely on what they had prepared, what they knew, and how well they could improvise when something went wrong, which it always did. The first of the survival skills that defined Appalachian mountain life was one that modern people almost never think about: reading the natural world for weather prediction. Before barometers, before weather services, before anything that resembled modern meteorology, mountain families developed an extraordinarily detailed system of environmental observation. They watched the behavior of woolly bear caterpillars in the fall, specifically how wide the brown band was compared to the black ends, as one indicator of winter severity. They noted whether squirrels were storing food aggressively or casually. They watched how high birds were building their nests, understanding that animals responding to atmospheric pressure changes they couldn't consciously perceive were giving information that could not be found anywhere else. A sudden ache in old scar tissue, in joints that had been broken and healed, was taken seriously as a pressure warning. Smoke from a chimney that hung low and spread rather than rising told experienced eyes that a storm was coming. These were not superstitions. They were pattern recognition built across decades of careful life-or-death observation. And they worked with a reliability that would have surprised anyone dismissing them as folk belief. The second skill was the management and preservation of fire, which in the mountains was a matter of genuine survival from October through March. Not just building a fire. Any person can build a fire with enough material. But maintaining one correctly through brutal cold, through wet wood, through wind that came down a chimney in gusts that could scatter coals across a dirt floor. Mountain families banked their fires every night with enormous care. Banking meant covering the hot coals with a thick layer of ash that would insulate them, hold the heat, and allow a fire to be rebuilt in the morning without the terrifying prospect of starting from nothing with freezing hands. The ash was not thrown away. It was collected in a specific container, often a wooden ash hopper, because hardwood ash was a critical resource used in making lye for soap, in processing corn into hominy, and in dozens of other applications. The fireplace itself in a mountain cabin was often the size of a small room, designed to serve simultaneously as heat source, cooking surface, and light. Learning to cook over an open hearth, managing heat by the distance from the flame, by the type of wood burning, by the thickness of the iron cookware, was a skill that took years to develop fully, and that the modern kitchen gives almost no preparation for. The third skill was the identification, harvesting, and preparation of medicinal plants, a practice so deeply embedded in Appalachian culture that it persisted well into the 20th century in communities where formal medicine was simply unavailable or too expensive to consider. Mountain healers, often women, often called granny women, carried knowledge of the local plant pharmacopoeia that was genuinely sophisticated. Bloodroot was used as an antibacterial agent. Wild ginger treated nausea. Black cohosh was used for a range of complaints that would later be validated by pharmaceutical research. Slippery elm bark, when boiled into a thick tea, could coat an inflamed throat or digestive tract in a way that provided real relief. Poultices, made from plantain leaves, the common roadside plant, drew infection out of wounds with surprising effectiveness. The knowledge of which plant, at which stage of growth, in which preparation, for which complaint, was not casual knowledge. It was encyclopedic, and it was passed directly from one person to another through long years of apprenticeship. When that chain of transmission broke, when young people left the mountains for cities and factories, and the knowledge had no one to pass to, it did not go somewhere else. It simply stopped existing in living form. The fourth skill was hunting, but not hunting as recreation. Hunting as a cold season protein strategy with no margin for failure. Mountain hunters of the 18th and 19th centuries used rifles that required a series of precise steps just to load a single shot. Measuring powder, seeding a patch and ball, priming the pan. And so they developed an attitude toward shooting that was almost nothing like modern sport hunting. They did not take uncertain shots. They did not rush. They understood that every shot that missed was not just a failed attempt, but a wasted resource that could not be easily replaced. Since lead and powder had to be purchased or traded for at considerable inconvenience, they also had an intimate knowledge of animal behavior that came from spending entire days, across entire seasons, in the same terrain. They knew where deer bedded in different kinds of weather. They knew how long after a hard frost the squirrels would stay in the trees before descending. They knew the routes that turkeys traveled between roosting areas and feeding grounds. This was not information from a book. It was earned slowly, through failure and patience. The fifth skill, and one of the most important, was the cold weather preservation of meat without refrigeration. When a large animal was taken, particularly in fall or early winter, the entire family understood that nothing could be wasted. A full-grown white-tailed deer, dressed out, might yield 60 to 80 pounds of usable meat. In a mountain hollow in January, with a family of 6 and 4 more months of cold ahead, that deer was the difference between security and hunger. Salt preservation was the primary method. Packing meat tightly in barrels with coarse salt to draw out moisture and prevent bacterial growth. But the technique required the right ratio, the right temperature, and the right amount of time. Too warm during the curing process and the meat spoiled despite the salt. Not enough salt and the center of a thick cut never cured properly. Mountain families who had been doing this for generations had internalized the variables through accumulated failure. And they passed that knowledge forward with enormous care. Smoking was the secondary preservation method, using hardwoods, hickory, apple, cherry, that imparted both flavor and antimicrobial compounds from the combustion. Smokehouses were small outbuildings built specifically for this purpose, designed to allow smoke flow while keeping pests out, and they represented a significant investment of labor that reflected exactly how important their function was. The sixth skill was the processing of corn, specifically a technique called nixtamalization, though mountain families would not have used that word. They knew it simply as making hominy. Dried corn soaked in a solution of water and wood ash lye underwent a chemical transformation that fundamentally changed its nutritional profile. The process broke down the outer hull of the kernel and released niacin, vitamin B3, that is bound in a form the human body cannot absorb in untreated corn. Communities that ate large amounts of corn without nixtamalization developed pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease that caused skin lesions, severe digestive problems, cognitive deterioration, and eventually death. Mountain families who had inherited the technique originally developed thousands of years earlier by indigenous peoples of the Americas, were protected from pellagra not because they understood the chemistry, but because they had been taught the practice. And the practice worked. It is one of the most striking examples in American history of survival knowledge existing as transmitted habit, rather than understood science, and of what happened when that habit was interrupted. In the early 20th century, when corn milling became industrialized and hominy production declined, pellagra swept through poor communities across the American South in epidemic numbers, killing an estimated 100,000 people between 1906 and 1940. The seventh skill was the construction and maintenance of root cellars, underground storage rooms, typically dug into a hillside, that used the thermal mass of the earth to maintain a near constant temperature of approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. In a root cellar, potatoes would keep until April, apples lasted through February, turnips, cabbages, carrots, beets, all the dense root vegetables that mountain families grew through the short summer, could be stored through the coldest months without freezing and without rotting at the rate they would above ground. Building a good root cellar required understanding drainage, because a cellar that collected water would destroy everything inside it, and understanding airflow, because ventilation prevented the buildup of carbon dioxide from the vegetables themselves, which would accelerate spoilage. The best root cellars were engineered with a precision that their builders would have laughed at calling engineering, because it was just knowledge. It was just what you did. The eighth skill was the rendering and storage of lard, which was the primary cooking fat across Appalachian mountain life for well over a century, when a hog was butchered in late fall, and hog butchering was a significant community event, a day of coordinated labor involving multiple families. The fat was carefully stripped and rendered by slow cooking until the water cooked out, and the pure white fat could be strained and poured into crocks. Properly rendered and sealed lard kept for months without refrigeration. It fried, it baked, it waterproofed leather, it lubricated tool parts, it went into soap, it formed the base of medicinal salves. The labor of rendering it was significant and the result was precious. Nothing from the animal was dismissed. Blood went into puddings. Organs were eaten immediately. Bones were cracked for their marrow and then boiled for broth. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. The skin was either eaten as crackling or dried and used. The idea that any part of the animal was waste would have been incomprehensible to a mountain family who had spent months feeding that hog in anticipation of exactly this moment. The ninth skill was reading and navigating terrain without any instrument except observation and memory. Mountain families who traveled through the hollows and over the ridges of their home country did not use maps, because maps of those areas either did not exist or were wildly inaccurate. They navigated by watershed, by the shape of the land and the direction water flowed, and by a mental library of landmarks that they built across a lifetime of walking the same terrain in every season. They knew which ridge ran north-south, and they knew it not because a compass told them, but because they knew where the sun set over it in summer and where it set in winter. They knew which hollows held water year-round and which dried up by August. They knew which creek crossings were safe after a heavy rain, and which turned into raging channels that would sweep a horse off its feet. This geographic intimacy with a specific landscape was one of the most valuable survival assets a mountain person could have, and it is the kind of knowledge that is almost impossible to acquire, except through years of lived experience in the same place. The 10th skill was building and using a spring house to extend the cold storage of perishables. Many mountain homesteads were deliberately sited near a reliable spring, a cold water source that emerged from the ground at a consistent temperature year-round, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. A spring house was a small structure built directly over this water source, designed to capture the coolness radiating off the moving water and use it to keep butter, milk, eggs, and other dairy products at a temperature that dramatically slowed spoilage. A good spring house could keep fresh butter solid and unspoiled for days in summer heat that would otherwise turn it rancid in hours. The management of dairy, the skimming of cream, the churning of butter, the making of simple cheeses, was also a full skill set in itself, and one that required daily attention, specific temperatures, and precise timing to do correctly. The 11th skill was the making of soap from wood, ash lye, and rendered fat, a process that sounds simple until you attempt it, and then reveals itself as a chemistry experiment that will humiliate you several times before you get it right. The ash hopper collected rainwater filtered through hardwood ash to produce lye solution. The concentration of that lye had to be tested, traditionally by floating a fresh egg or a potato in it, which would sink too deep if the lye was too weak and float too high if it was too strong. At the right concentration, a potato would bob at a very specific depth. That lye was then combined with rendered fat over heat, and the mixture had to be stirred almost continuously during the saponification process that turned fat and alkali into soap. The process took hours. Done wrong, it produced either a greasy mess or a caustic substance that burned skin. Done right, it produced a soft soap, sometimes called barrel soap because it was stored in wooden barrels rather than cut into bars, that was used for everything from bathing to laundry to treating certain skin conditions. The 12th skill was the building and management of a grist mill, or the relationship with the miller who operated the nearest one. Corn had to be ground into meal to be useful for baking, and the hand-cranked grinding of corn is exhausting work that produces a modest amount of meal for significant labor. Water-powered grist mills existed throughout the Appalachian valleys wherever a creek ran with sufficient force, and the miller was a critical figure in the community economy, taking a toll, a portion of the grain, in payment for grinding. But getting to the mill required travel that was impossible in the worst of winter. Mountain families managed this by grinding in bulk before the worst of the cold, by keeping their own small hand mills for emergency use, and by calculating their cornmeal supply through the winter with the same careful attention they applied to their salt pork and their firewood. The 13th skill was the construction and use of the smokehouse as a preservation facility over the course of an entire winter. Unlike a single smoking session, the management of a smokehouse in the mountain tradition involved careful attention to temperature, wood choice, airflow, and duration, and it required vigilance against pests that had their own strong interest in the contents. Rats, raccoons, and opossums were persistent threats. The design of the smokehouse evolved over generations to address these threats, with smooth wooden posts that resisted climbing and with doors fitted precisely enough to prevent entry. Hams and shoulders might hang in a well-managed mountain smokehouse for 6 months or more before being brought down and eaten, becoming progressively drier and more concentrated in flavor over that time. The 14th skill was wild plant foraging, not as a supplement to grocery shopping, but as a primary food source for specific seasons. Early spring in Appalachia brought a profound hunger. The stores from winter were running low. Hunting was unpredictable, and the garden hadn't produced anything yet. But the forest and the creek banks were full of food for those who knew where to look. Ramps, wild onions with broad, flat leaves and a sharp, almost aggressive flavor, emerged early and were gathered in large quantities, eaten fresh or preserved in various ways. Watercress grew in cold running water. Pokeweed could be eaten as a green in its early stages, though the mature plant was toxic, a critical distinction that required exact knowledge and that killed people who got it wrong. Morel mushrooms appeared under the right conditions in spring and were one of the most valuable finds a forager could make. Blackberries, huckleberries, serviceberries, pawpaws, persimmons. The wild fruit calendar of Appalachia ran from late spring through early fall, and families who followed it could put up significant stores of jam, dried fruit, and fermented goods. The 15th skill was the management of what was called a kitchen garden, a small, intensively cultivated plot immediately adjacent to the house, typically tended primarily by women, that produced the dense calorie, long-storing crops that carried families through winter. Beans were the centerpiece of the Appalachian kitchen garden, specifically varieties that had been selected and saved across generations for their productivity in mountain conditions, their disease resistance, and their storage quality when dried. Some of these varieties, now called heirloom varieties and sold at considerable prices in seed catalogs, were maintained by mountain families for 200 years or more, passed neighbor to neighbor in paper envelopes or glass jars, never sold or cataloged but simply continued because they worked. The seed-saving skill itself was crucial, selecting the best specimens of each plant to save seed from, drying and storing those seeds correctly so they remained viable through winter, and knowing which plants could be allowed to cross-pollinate without harming the variety. The 16th skill was the making of wooden tools and implements through handwork, specifically the skills of the froe, the draw knife, and the spoke shave, which allowed a skilled hand to split and shape green wood into useful objects without a sawmill or a lathe. White oak split along its grain into incredibly strong strips that were woven into baskets capable of carrying heavy loads. Hickory, which is both hard and flexible, was shaped into axe handles and tool handles designed to absorb shock without breaking. Cherry and walnut were worked into furniture and storage items. The entire built environment of a mountain homestead. Every shelf, every cabinet, every chair, every bed frame, every fence rail came from wood processed this way, and the skills required to do it well were not casual. A poorly hung axe head was dangerous. A basket woven without understanding the grain of the split could collapse at the worst moment. This was craft in the oldest sense of the word, and it required years of practice to do correctly. The 17th skill was the identification and processing of natural dyes from plant material. A skill that sounds decorative but was actually practical, because the ability to dye fabric was tied to the ability to distinguish garments from one another, to identify ownership of items, and to mark different uses of cloth. Butternut shells produced a warm brown that was so common in mountain dress that Confederate soldiers recruited from the Appalachian highlands were sometimes called butternuts. Black walnut hulls gave an almost permanent dark brown that was extremely difficult to remove from anything it touched. Various sumacs, goldenrods, and ironweeds contributed yellows and greens. Pokeweed berries, handled carefully because the mature plant was toxic, gave a deep crimson. The mordanting process, treating fabric with substances like alum or iron to fix the dye permanently, was also part of this skill set. And the difference between dye that lasted and dye that washed out in the first rain was entirely a matter of knowing and correctly executing the mordanting step. The 18th skill was the making and use of tallow candles and fat lamps for light, because in a mountain cabin in the 1800s, darkness came early and stayed long, and the ability to continue working after sunset was not optional. Tallow was rendered beef or mutton fat, treated and purified similarly to lard, and poured around fiber wicks that were hung in molds or dipped repeatedly to build up the body of the candle. A single good candle provided enough light to read by, if you had something to read, and enough to see by while doing handwork in the evening. Fat lamps, Simpler devices that burned grease in a small dish with a twisted fabric wick provided a dimmer and smokier light, but required no molds and no special preparation. The light from either was far less bright than any modern source, which meant that mountain households organized their work around available daylight to a degree that is almost impossible to imagine from inside an electrically lit world. The 19th skill was the making of a specific category of tools called notched traps. Deadfall traps and wire snares used to take small game and fur-bearing animals without using ammunition. Rabbits, squirrels, opossums, muskrats, and groundhogs could all be taken in well-set traps, and trap lines, routes through the woods that a hunter or trapper walked every morning to check, were a standard part of mountain subsistence life through the winter. Mink and beaver and otter provided furs that could be traded. The meat from smaller animals supplemented whatever larger game was available. A well-run trapline required specific knowledge of animal habit and habitat, where rabbits ran, where minks hunted along creek banks, and the ability to read and interpret animal sign, tracks in snow, scrapes in bark, the remains of a meal left by an animal that had passed through. The 20th skill was waterproofing and maintenance of leather, because boots and harness and the leather components of every tool and implement a mountain family owned would deteriorate rapidly without regular treatment. The primary waterproofing agent was rendered beef tallow or bear grease, worked into the leather with hands and fingers until the material was supple and resistant to water. Mountain boots that were regularly treated with fat resisted the effects of creek crossings and wet grass. Boots that were neglected cracked at the seams and failed in the worst possible conditions. Harness that was properly maintained kept a team of horses working for decades. Harness that cracked through neglect could fail in the middle of a field at planting time, which, in the mountain calendar, was a catastrophe with no margin for recovery. The 21st skill was the construction and use of the outdoor bake oven, a stone or clay structure separate from the house, specifically designed for bread baking, which required sustained high and consistent heat that a cook fire inside a cabin could not reliably provide. The bake oven was loaded with hardwood fire and allowed to burn until the interior walls were uniformly hot. Then the fire was raked out, and the bread was loaded directly onto the hot floor of the oven. The retained heat in the stone walls cooked the bread over the next hour or more, without any active fire. This technique produced even baking that an open fire could not match, and it allowed families to bake large quantities at once, a full day's output of bread, rather than cooking individual items one at a time. Cornbread, biscuits, bean bread made with cooked and dried bean flour mixed into the dough. These were not occasional treats but daily staples, and the mastery of the bake oven was a significant skill. The 22nd skill was the art of reading sign, specifically the ability to move through a forest and understand from physical evidence what had happened there recently. This was not mystical. It was applied observation at a very high level of detail. A track in mud that showed claw marks forward of the toe pad was a dog or a coyote, pressing with its full paw, moving quickly. A track that showed no claw marks was a cat, moving carefully. The difference in the disturbance of leaves on either side of a trail told you which direction an animal had been moving. The freshness of a track, how sharp its edges were, whether frost had formed inside it, whether rain had blurred its definition, told you approximately when it had been made. Mountain hunters moved through their territory reading this constant record of activity, understanding the patterns of animal movement that made the difference between a productive hunt and a cold day in the woods. The 23rd skill was the understanding of water. Specifically, the ability to assess the quality and safety of a water source. In an era before germ theory was understood or accepted, mountain people knew empirically that certain water sources made them sick and others did not, even if they could not explain why. They preferred water that emerged from the ground as a spring over water, taken from a slow-moving or stagnant pool. They knew that water taken downstream of a settlement was more likely to cause illness than water taken upstream. They boiled water for certain preparations and drank it raw from sources they trusted. The underlying reason, the presence of bacterial contamination, was unknown to them. But the pattern recognition that told them which water was safe and which was suspect was built on enough generations of experience with the consequences that it constituted genuine protective knowledge. The 24th skill was the preservation of eggs for winter use. Chickens, responding to the shortening days of fall, dramatically reduced their laying and often stopped entirely in winter, which meant that families who wanted eggs in January had to put them up in autumn when hens were producing at their peak. Several techniques existed: water, glassing, submerging fresh eggs in a solution of hydrated lime, created an alkaline environment that sealed the pores of the eggshell and prevented the entry of bacteria, keeping eggs viable for 6 months or more. Coating eggs in lard or beeswax also sealed them. Keeping eggs cool, ideally in the root cellar, slowed deterioration. A properly water-glassed egg, kept cool, would still be good in March, though it was noticeably different in texture from a fresh egg. Acceptable in cooked dishes, but not ideal for frying. The 25th skill, and in some ways the most important of all, was the skill of improvisation. The ability to solve a problem with whatever materials were at hand when the materials you needed were not available. A harness fitting that broke in winter might be repaired with carved wood and twisted rawhide. A broken axe handle might be replaced with a piece of hickory shaped by hand over an afternoon. A window glass that cracked could be replaced temporarily with oiled paper that admitted some light while blocking wind. A child's shoe that wore through could be resoled with a piece of green hide nailed in place and allowed to dry tightly around the foot. The mountain homestead was a system of continuous improvisation, driven by the simple reality that sending someone to town for a replacement part was often not possible and was always expensive. The question was never, "Where do I buy this?" It was always, "What do I have and what can I make it do?" That question, "What do I have and what can I make it do?" is one that most people living in the 21st century are almost entirely unprepared to answer. The supply chain does that thinking for them. The delivery network does that problem solving. The infrastructure of modern life is so thoroughly designed around consumption that the skills of production, the skills of making, of preserving, of improvising have become almost entirely decorative. People take classes in them on weekends as a way of touching something that feels real. They buy equipment for hobbies that were once necessities. They watch videos about people living the way their great-grandparents lived, and they feel something that is hard to name but is probably some version of recognition. The sensation of remembering a capability that belongs to them somewhere below the level of conscious memory. What happened in the Appalachian Mountains over 2 centuries was not primitive. It was sophisticated in all the ways that actually matter when the systems we depend on are unavailable. The people who lived there were not waiting for the world to come to them. They were building everything they needed from what the land provided and what they knew, passing that knowledge forward with the seriousness it deserved. Understanding at a level that came from genuine consequence that the knowledge was not optional. It was survival. It was life. The mountains are still there. The hollows are quieter than they used to be. Many of them emptied out across the 20th century as people followed roads and railroads towards cities and factories and wages. The homesteads that remain are mostly in stages of return to forest. Their root cellars caved in. Their smokehouses gone to rot and weather. But the knowledge those places produced, the 25 skills and the hundreds of smaller skills contained within them, that knowledge still exists in fragments, in old letters and journals, in the memories of a few people old enough to have learned from those who learned directly, in the techniques preserved by small groups and societies that understood, before most people did, that this information was worth keeping. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. That somewhere in the oldest mountains on the continent, knowledge that kept people alive for 2 centuries is still waiting. Not in a file, not in a database, but in the hands and the memory of the few people who chose to carry it forward. Quietly, patiently, the way all the most important things have always been kept.